dualism. It's about the difference between the physical world and our mental life. And this is a thing that can change philosophy. And I've said this over and over again. This is why philosophy is corrupt, is that we've gotten some of these ideas wrong. Today, we're talking about this overall idea about dualism. And dualism's been around since day one. And it means that we live in two worlds. And often it's framed in the context of things versus ideas, body versus mind, things like that. And so those things are true. They are relevant to the idea of dualism. But I think part of the problem is that we've gotten it upside down. What are the two ideas regarding dualism? And so we're going to try to explain both those, the physical world and the mental world. This is a real channel. If I'm bringing all of this, my made up experience, 30 years of teaching students nothing, if I'm bringing that to this particular real channel, we're going to try to get something out of it. We're going to get something different. And I've said this before. I used to say this to students all the time. If you think the world's perfect, no need to do any more work. But if you think the world's not perfect, philosophy is the business of crisis, which means when things need to change, oftentimes the surface level ideas cannot affect that change. And so people don't really understand what they believe or what they want or what they're doing intellectually. So part of it is you have to teach. And so whether you're teaching a child because you're a parent, whether you're teaching someone because you're a teacher, whether you're teaching someone on through a video, you have to be processing this information in order to transfer something from you to them that's real. And so we're talking about dualism. I hope you can see where we're going with these two ideas, but we're also trying to find something new. So we're also going to make a longer video. So I'm going to have to do it in little pieces. So that's the first idea is we're putting out a basic definition of dualism. And then the second part is talking about the difference between new philosophy and historic philosophy. That is that you can do philosophy or you can talk about history. Those are two very different things. So part three is going to be outlining what it means to say we live in a physical world. And so when we talk about body mind, this is the body. The physical world is the world external to whatever's going on in our head. And so Descartes' point was that the only thing you can be absolutely certain about is your inner life. That's also your inner voice. There was a focus in the 17th century that went into the 18th century that got reversed, and it got reversed by John Locke. It got reversed by David Hume. So what is the physical world? The physical world is external objects that realism believes we have direct access to. Thomas Reid believed we did have direct access to those things. You can go through the philosophers and how they feel about our access to things in the external world. Thomas Reid, for example, which is extremely interesting, thought that objects, things in the external world presented themselves to your mind. That presentation was automatic. It wasn't substantially filtered by perception, which is what people now believe. There was an intermediary, that perception, but that didn't change the fact. One of Reid's points was that part of the substance of the perception is belief. So the fact that it comes to your mind and then you believe it are the two components that are necessary for this direct realism, which means there isn't a filter between you and the thing. That filter is just you're just imagining that the distance and the infrastructure, which we understood very well, was changing the thing when in fact you're looking at irrelevant components of the experience when you're talking about it being changed. Because what's important was that immediate impression, that immediate interaction between you and the thing. Anyway, that's how different people view the physical world. But we can just say the physical world is that realm where there's externality, which means things are different from us. Things don't occupy the same space as us mentally, because in fact, one of the physical characteristics of the world is us. So our body, independent from our mental life, would in fact be part of the physical world. So the physical world has always been the thing that science was distilling knowledge down to. Science's business was to understand, was to create this percentage chance of things being true in the future so you can use what science discovered as a tool, but the physical world was the realm. And so the things that were external to you were the things that were of interest to science. But what's interesting is science has turned other things, what might have in the past not been considered external, like your own mental life, into the same objects, into objects of that scientific exploration. So much so that the idea of consciousness, as we discuss it, especially in modern times, is external to us. We look at it as a thing in nature, our consciousness. There is a lot more nuance and complexity to this idea of a physical world. But I do want you to see that different philosophers have treated this very differently to the extent that it's changed through the 17th century and now the 29th century or wherever we are. And so that change is part of what we're discussing. We're discussing whether things have been altered in terms of perspective and created almost a new world of intellectual thought, which is to say, when we talk about consciousness now and when we talked about it in the 17th century, we may be talking about two very different things. And certainly to us, they appear as very different through those different contextual languages. But the physical world simply is, as best we can understand it, in our dualist perspective, those things separate from an external to a mental life. So let's move on in the next section to what the mental life even means so we can try to form some kind of new understanding. Now we're really getting into it. I'm going to need my glasses for this one. We're talking about dualism. We're talking about the mental life. This is a way of describing what's going on inside our head. We do need to talk about history a little bit and the way this has been seen, because philosophers, especially empiricists, like to say if we experience something directly, that is a real thing. That's the simple explanation for empiricism and the empiricist worldview. What I would like to suggest, and I'm sure it's been suggested a million times by philosophers, and that is that the thing that we have the most intimate contact with is, in fact, the mental life. And so if we think of the mental life as an environment, if we think of the physical world as an environment, the mental world as an environment, we can start to talk about which one we should emphasize, how we should think of them in relation to each other, and how much we should prioritize these things. Because my argument's going to be that scientism is, if nothing else, the prioritization of the physical world and the direct experience we have there or that we expect to have over a mental life, which is seen as a byproduct of the physical experience, the physical life itself. The byproduct of that is simply this mental life, which is dreamlike and of no consequence. And that's not, of course, what everyone says, but it seems to be the overarching emphasis within the language game. And I would say that there's this large intellectual language game, which has been a transition from a dualist worldview to more of a monist worldview. So when we talk about mental life, we're talking about what's going on in your head, the voices in your head, how you experience everything. That also means that everything you do in terms of science and in terms of the physical world is predated by what's going on in your head. It means that when you experience something physically, it really is an experience you're having in your mental life. And so the mental life is also the thing you have the most contact with, which is why it's strange to de-emphasize it and have it be a byproduct. If you think about the physical world, what you think of as the physical world, you're in that world half the time at best. When you're sleeping, you're not in it, but also when you're lost in thought, when you're reading books or watching movies. There's a lot of things you do that take you out of what you would think of as direct experience with the physical world, so much so that it does seem you could make the case that that's the world that's more ephemeral, that's more detached, that's more even simulated. And so, what are the things that motivate us the most? What is the parts of our life that make us us? And they are wants, dreams, hopes, choices, moods, emotions. All of those things, whether you like them or not, seem to be what dictate the outcomes in the future. They dictate who you are. They dictate where you actually go, which is to say, if you don't make a choice in your mental life about the physical world, you're going to go nowhere. You need to decide to become a doctor or a lawyer. And then the consequences of that physical experience in the law office are dictated by the choices in the mental life. And so it is strange from intellectual perspective that what we see is a de-emphasis of the environment that we find ourselves in more of the time, because in fact, we're in that environment 24/7. We dream in that environment, we imagine in that environment, we make choices in that environment, we even are awake in that environment. It follows us everywhere. And so to not look at that as a world or what I'm calling an environment and to only focus on the physical environment seems to be reversing the process, turning it upside down, turning it on its head. That's ultimately one of the expressions of what I'm saying about how philosophy has gotten reversed or de-emphasized, whether it was denial of the self, denial of ideas in general, fundamental absolutes, truth itself. Reed's point was denying those things too far into skepticism about those things will lose most people. So much so that in the 21st century, no one even knows what philosophy is and no one cares. And if you bring up a lot of these questions, people say, I have no concern at all. And that's why people watch my videos. They watch the first 30 seconds. I could have more hooks than a fishing contest, and people would be uninterested because they don't know what I'm talking about because it's not part of their language game. And so, really, the goal is just to switch that to get people more interested in the 18th century when they were discussing a mental life after somebody like Rene Descartes talked about how the only thing verifiable is our consciousness, is almost direct experience of our mental life and ours alone. We'll move now to the conclusion about what it looks like as a philosopher to think about this switch and to think about these two realms or environments in distinctly this way. To sum up this dualist perspective that I'm calling new. And so, what I'm trying to do is change when people focus on the physical world as the real metaphysical entity, as the thing with the real objects that we should be concerned about. And the mental world is being a byproduct of things like a physical thing like the brain. So the mental life is just a byproduct of the activity of physical things, atoms and neurons. That's what I'm trying to change in order for us to be able to understand bigger ideas, how to think about direct experience, and whether this thing that we call consciousness, which is what I'm calling mental life, is nothing. And we can go back to John Locke and we can talk about Reed's reaction to Locke as being an historical example of maybe when some of this changed. Because I always say it was the 18th century. And so Locke, for example, made a physicalist statement about how we view the idea of self, because back then people were still worried about ideas that were bigger that I'm talking about now, but they debated them. And then the conclusion of that debate was later in the 18th century when they decided, where they sided more with the physicalist perspective that we have today, which is that these physical objects are the things that are real, even if that physical object is the brain. One of the things Locke said was that the idea of self can only be maintained through memory. And that means the idea that we have an enduring self. And so the enduring, he called it personal identity, in contrast to the identity of a person, which other people can see. The personal identity is our own mental life enduring, which means we wake up same person day to day in some substantial way. He said the only way to tie that together is memory. And so what he meant by that, though, is that without memory, we would then be reduced to this physicalist explanation, which is where Hume gets this from. Hume was continuing on with the Lockean tradition, and Reed was really going against it. And people remark all the time about how funny it is because Reed wanted to debate with Hume, but didn't want to directly do it. And so he often made fun of the Humean ideas that he saw in John Locke. So Locke's point was that it was purely memory, and Reed wanted to go against it and say there's more to the idea of self, which is really to say what I'm saying, which is that there's more to this environment than we've now made it out to be. And we're in a different world now. But back in 1750, 1760, Reed's response to this was the brave officer. And it was a fairly simple outline to disprove the idea that an enduring self can only be defined by memory. And that is that as a young boy, the officer was flogged for stealing apples. When he was an officer, middle-aged, he did a heroic deed. And then later in life, when he was a general, and so the second stage, the officer can remember being the boy, but the general can only remember being the officer, but he can't remember the apples. And so what we have is this older third stage of identity doesn't retain the memory from the childhood, can only retain the memory of the middle age. So following the Lockean theory, what we have is a different person from the first stage to the third stage. So because the general can remember the officer, that's considered enduring identity. Because the officer can remember the boy, that's considered enduring identity. But the first and third don't remember the general didn't remember the boy. So is what Locke's saying is those are actually different people because the general lacks that memory. And so Reed was trying to point out that that's not how we see things and that that's not how we view identity. And you have to remember Reed's entire philosophy was built in the idea that these are absolutes, they are givens, they are built in, they are universal. The only thing you would be questioning is the definition of the thing itself, which means we already know it exists and then we're questioning its existence after the fact. I don't know if that even made any sense. So, in conclusion, what I'm saying though is that we need to talk about them differently. So, in terms of a philosophy channel, a real one, we're talking about is viewing these two environments differently and then deciding which one is more influential in our lives in a utilitarian sense, just so that we can see maybe this transvaluation, this shift. Not necessarily which one you have to believe 100% of the time, but that you do identify a shift where the mental world is given secondary status and the physical world is given this primary empirical status. And so by seeing that shift and seeing that transvaluation, we come away with a better understanding when we talk about any of these questions about dualism. But I did want to say also, as part of the conclusion, that we're not moving toward what might be called New Age metaphysics. We're not moving towards some idea that mental life is something other than what it is. And the way I've described this to students is that regardless of any of my theories and my hypotheticals, I'm always a materialist. And most people fall over when I tell them that. And the reason I'm saying that is because I don't identify my general concept of material with everything that we've previously known as material, which means anything we discover about consciousness in the future can still retain some materialist explanation. It would just be a different material or it would be a new material, a very different way of looking at material. But in some sense, when you go into it with a new age metaphysics and you start to create a dualism about material and immaterial or body and soul, which is, I think, the thing that got people distracted a long, long time ago, then I think you enter into a realm where you're using words that don't help as much, especially in talking about these two environments, mental and physical life. And so we're not moving towards some kind of what might be called non-philosophical spiritual metaphysic. We're not moving towards some immaterial concept or some world above that is potentially completely different in terms of how we look at ontology and being, which means material's one thing and spirit's another. We're not doing that. We can still move on with this conclusion that we need to focus on these two environments. Thanks for shopping.